We are going to be talking about the Western rock lobster fishery or the Western Australian rock lobster fishery, and then the Chilean artisanal fisheries. So the Western rock lobster, if we can page, Teresa. Awesome. So the Western rock lobster is endemic to the Western Australian coast and supports a large fishery that generates about 200 to 400 million Australian dollars per year. And during the 2010-2011 season, they transitioned from an output-based system or from an input to an output-based system, which prioritized maximum economic yield and total allowable catch, along with prioritizing individually transferable quotas. This reduced overall costs, simplified management systems, and actually increased catch value from the previous system by a total of $18 USD per kilogram. They also introduced a 12-month-long lobster season, which meant that fishers could choose to wait for a more opportune time to catch rather than fishing during times of low recruitment, low egg production, or low breeder levels. And this improved the fishery resilience as a whole, but also benefited fishers who could strategically fish during periods of high demand, so they profited more while actually catching less. So under this system, they were reaching their maximum economic yield without getting close to the maximum sustainable yield, which was really a big win for lobster populations and coastal communities alike. Now, we know that ITQs can be troublesome because of their transferable feature, but so far there haven't been any issues with any out-of-state ownership of ITQs, and Australia mandates that 80% of the lobster processing companies are actually Australian owned. ITQs do raise concerns for smaller scale fisheries, so Australia's adopted these access rights, which are really similar to franchise rights and make fishers the owner of a teeny tiny portion of lobster resources. So this can help protect them from catch share changes, stock shifts, and introduce buyback provisions. It's recommended that with the introduction of ITQs, sport and artisanal fishery rights are defined in conjunction with commercial lobster fishing rights, and that consistent formal economic analyses are done to ensure ITQs are managed effectively. So the Western Australia lobster fishery found success in focusing on the outputs or catch and economic yield, which eventually circled back to provide better conditions for the lobster populations themselves. And then for the Chilean artisanal fisheries.
All right, so Chilean artisanal fisheries are defined as small-scale fisheries, most often based around family units. This is one of the largest industries in Chile. It contributes around 500,000 jobs and provides some significantly higher exports than the industrial fishing sector. So about in the 90s, after decades of declining shellfish stocks, the Chilean government passed the Fisheries and Aquaculture General Act in 1991, and this act restructured the open access policies that had been implemented previously. The first change was the development of management and exploitation areas for benthic resources. These areas were placed along the coastline and provided exclusive fishing rights for the benthic resources found there. Access was only awarded to registered fishermen groups, similar to unions that were centered around caletas or coves. Each group, once registered and approved by the Chilean government, was given almost complete control over the exclusive artisanal fishing zone. These exclusive zones were known as TERFs, or territorial use rights for fishing, and are indefinite as long as certain requirements are followed. These requirements include yearly stock assessments from a third-party fishery consultant, a ban on aquaculture and hatchery stocking, and a yearly fee for the right to use the land. There are many benefits to belonging to a group, as the government incentivizes their creation by allowing them to create their own quotas and set their own market prices. The implementation of these TERFs has shown promising effects on shellfish populations. Loco, or the sea snail, populations were completely decimated in the 80s. However, after the responsibility for sustainable fishing was handed over to the artisanal fishers, the populations rebounded. A study in 1993 showed that in artisanally regulated areas, the catch was significantly greater, with up to 10 times higher catch per unit effort than the nearby open access areas. The mean size was also greater when access was restricted, which equates to more financial gains in the MEAs than the traditional open access fisheries. The system is not perfect. However, it's been shown that the shift in management has led to stronger leadership, as well as a reduction in poaching and illegal fishing, because there's a stronger sense of community engagement and more direct financial support from the artisanal fishing industry. So now for some similarities and differences.
Yeah, so both the Chilean and Australian governments implemented legislation at the federal level. Teresa?
Fishers were also given more control and stewardship over their fishery. This allows fishers to act in accordance with market demand prices to increase personal profit, giving them more authority over their livelihoods. In the case of Chile, the artisanal fishers are the primary stakeholders, which means that they make the decisions and prioritize what's important to them.
And in the case of Australia, the fishers are not the primary stakeholders, but they're given some protection under their franchise-esque laws.
There also was use of ITQs in both Chile and Australia. In Chile, the Fisheries and Aquaculture General Act reformed the industrial fishing sector using ITQs, the individual transferable quotas. Uniquely, Chile required that 10% of the transferable or of the catch goes up for auction every year, with each bidder only allowed to purchase 50% of what is up for auction. This prevents monopolies from forming. And ITQs only make up a small part of the fishing industry in Chile, and more research is going into the coexistence of artisanal fisheries and industrial fisheries with regards to these ITQs.
Yeah, and Australia also used ITQs in their successful management, but there weren't any additional caveats to prevent monopolies of quotas, though as previously stated, there wasn't any issues with out-of-state buying. So far that's been okay, but they were definitely introduced to help the commercial fisheries and weren't really considered, or the independent fisheries weren't really considered when they implemented the ITQs. So kind of for separate reasons, which leads us to some of the differences between the two. The initial priorities of Australia and Chile were very, very different. Australia, which is acting as our global north, focused on profiting first, which eventually created sustainability. In areas of large scale and more commercial fishing, profits are valued over the ecosystem. And so the lobster fishery is considered a success because they got profits and then profit begets sustainability. So it was a win-win.
In the global south, they actually focused on sustainability, which then created profit. The FAGO law was passed as a result of the loco shellfish fishery collapsing, and other important stocks were also on the verge of collapse. So authority was given to the artisanal fisheries to preserve populations, and then economic growth and prosperity came as a result of that.
Yeah, both of them also had a large disparity in resources, and there were far more articles just in general about the global north than there were the global south, and it's likely due to unequal resources and wealth allocation, allowing the richer countries to fund more successful and sustainable projects, so we can hear more about it. And we also need to consider that the global north has greater access to the metrics of measuring success itself. Like for instance, for the ITQs to work in Australia, researchers suggested that there was a consistent analysis of the state's economics, which wouldn't be possible in poorer areas.
So very little research or documentation exists about the Chilean artisanal fishers, which means very little external support or funding is given. And the Chilean government does not even contribute that much, with the main premise of the program being that the fishers are responsible. So they are the ones who deal with the consequences, and they're also the ones who reap the benefits, but they are mainly left alone.
Yeah, and our last difference is the definition of success. For the Western Australian lobster fishery, success is measured by the overall annual profit and a resilient fishery with lobster populations being maintained at a renewable and sustainable level, but again, for profit. Management systems that introduce ITQs and create profit at the commercial scale are more valued than the individual success of local fishers and smaller scale fisheries.
Success in Chilean artisanal fisheries is measured by community engagement and effective management being implemented in the areas. Profits are not the priority when defining a successful artisanal fishery.
So yeah, we know that there are more than one way to create success within the fishing world, and they can also be defined in a number of different ways. So thank you.